Welcome back, everybody, to Post Wrestling. I am John Pollock, and it is our quarterly trend to welcome this man back, who we're getting on back-to-back weeks here at Post Wrestling. No shortage of great stuff to talk about. He is Wrestlenomics' own Brandon Thurston. Brandon, welcome back.
Thanks again for having me, John. The market has closed, and WWE shares. The market is closing 2 minutes ago as of when we're recording this, and the shares have closed below $50. $49.23 is what I'm seeing on my Google machine right now.
Was that a surprise to you, the response some almost 24 hours since the release of the financials on Thursday?
Yeah, I mean, I never really know what to expect out of the share price. That's down 12%. That's a big drop.
Yes.
In the bigger picture, though, that the shares have been climbing pretty strongly since the last earnings report at the end of October. So to give it some context, like on Halloween, which I think is the day of the last report, or it was around that day, it was down to $38, and now it's at $49. So within the last 3 months, there's been a lot of growth, and the Peacock deal news came out, and a lot of the analysts have upgraded their estimates and their price targets. But I think the reason for shares being down is, the analysts expected a lot more profitable Q4 than we got. However, in the big picture, 2020 is the most profitable year in WWE history, adjusted for inflation. Even more, it was about twice as profitable as the Attitude Era, adjusted for inflation.
And for those that have been following your work, you largely mapped this out very early in the pandemic, that WWE, with the belief that their television deals would not be interrupted, stood to have their most profitable year to date. And I think when we rewind back to April and even into May, and we're looking at, any company facing this pandemic and what it could mean for them, I think it became kind of clear early on that the company, if they could maintain these television deals and the enormous amount of savings for those Performance Center Raws and SmackDowns, it turned out to be this unbelievable year. But this was something like you forecasted right at the beginning.
Yeah. And a lot of financial analysts, I don't think were far off. I guess what I was especially accurate about were the savings that WWE would make when they were at the Performance Center. I think the market didn't fully understand how cheap it was to run at the Performance Center. And now they've gone to the ThunderDome, but I was, writing the 2020 report, just got finished with that this week. And one of the things that, occurred to me, or at least that I thought enough of to write about, was that in another era, this would have been, COVID would have been devastating for the pro wrestling industry. If this was an era like in the 90s or the 80s that is largely supported by ticket revenue, you wouldn't have been able to run any events.
I would say, Brandon, up until, what would you say? Even if we're looking 10 years ago, I'm not saying it would plummet the company, but it would have been an enormous impact where you're taking out live events, and you would have to imagine there would be a certain impact on your pay-per-view business as well, relying on that completely. It's not to say pay-per-view would necessarily fall apart. The UFC has thrived in this era, but just given the impact that they would have on television, not having a Performance Center in place, and going even further back, you're right, it would have been devastating across the industry.
Yeah, I would have to look at what exactly the history is of TV revenues. TV revenues have gradually increased since the 90s, but it would have, there wouldn't have been any ticket revenues. There wouldn't have been at least any venue merchandise revenues. Just imagine if this was a period where online shopping wasn't as popular. One of the smaller stories out of this year is that e-commerce really increased and somewhat made up for the lack of any venue merchandise sales. But yeah, they were, this is a year where they were their most profitable ever when they got to sell basically no tickets after March. They didn't get to run their big Saudi events, large
scale international event.
Yes. Did you notice this? I've written about the language of WWE, but clearly this is extended to the earnings conference calls. You are not allowed to say Saudi Arabia event. You have to say large scale international event.
Yeah, Christina Salen was tripping over that term over and over. That was clear. It's obvious when there is a certain edict in place, and that was clearly one of them, that the The words Saudi Arabia were not going to be used to describe this big windfall of this fourth quarter and why they were not at the levels of the last quarter of 2019.
I was poring over the transcript of the earnings call today, and I did a control F for large scale international, and it appears 8 times, I think.
Wow.
And there's no mention of Saudi Arabia. But yeah.
So just looking at the whole year, just to throw out the figures here, revenue, a new record, $974.2 million, and that equates to net income of $131.8 million. And, you know, there was, I would say overall, we'll spend some time on the earnings call. Like, unlike many of the calls over the past year, Brandon, it seemed like television ratings certainly took a backseat as the hot topic. It seemed that the Peacock deal has greatly, I think, enhanced optimism, although ratings were addressed on the particular call and maybe got the most noteworthy soundbite out of Nick Khan and the linear eyeballs.
Yes. They have not lost eyeballs. It's just that eyeballs are switching from linear to digital, which just means people may not be watching as much on traditional television, but they're watching more in digital, YouTube, and social media ways, which, if you put the numbers together, which I have, I've tried to take the last few years and multiply the hours, you know, the amount of time in terms of duration of each of the Raw, SmackDown, NXT episodes that have been on linear TV, and then top that off with like 30% of the digital video viewing that they publish. And then what you do end up with is a pretty flat trend if you stack it all together. Now, digital video viewing is worth a very, very, very small fraction compared to what their linear television viewing is worth, which is driving about a majority of their revenue now. But I guess I can't really argue with him that their viewing overall, if you include the much cheaper digital eyeballs, is about flat. That said, the year-over-year declines, let's just say in Q4, I just tweeted this graph. You can see how AEW is down about 9% Q4 2020 versus Q4 2019, 9%. But everything else in the WWE ecosystem, SmackDown, Raw, NXT, is down to a greater degree. And it's a similar type of comparison when you talk about the key demo of 1849 or the younger part of that, 18 to 34. So it's clear that, well, and maybe just the conclusion is, you know, okay, we accept that all television is going to be on the decline over time for the indefinite future. Maybe this just means that AEW is getting more popular while WWE is sort of holding still. But like you said, there's some reassurance on the media rights value, because no matter how low WWE's television ratings are, the money that they get for their television rights is guaranteed, and in fact guaranteed to escalate over time. But the deal with Peacock, which is a property owned by NBC Universal, which also owns the USA Network, that gives people in the market some reassurance that, okay, when the next deal comes up, they'll start negotiating probably in late 2022. This is giving us some reassurance that NBC Universal is really invested in this WWE product, and they're probably going to continue to treat WWE well in the next round, because you probably don't want a Raw and to a lesser extent an NXT that's over on somebody else's channel when you've got when you're putting the pay-per-views on Peacock. And there was much discussion about how there's all these opportunities now when it comes to selling advertising and sponsorships, where NBCU will be more invested and they'll have more access to NBCU's ads and marketing teams and things like that. This is where Stephanie McMahon got a lot of talking time to talk about that.
Yes, Brandon. Every 3 years, there's a Super Bowl. Every 2 years, there's an Olympics. And every year, there's a WrestleMania. And I thought it was actually very smart on Stephanie's part to try and equate WrestleMania in the discussion of those major events. And I think WrestleMania this year will be an interesting litmus test to see the muscle that NBC puts behind promoting WrestleMania on their own Peacock streaming service and what that means. Like, I think like this would be the year to see how significant that push is, which could be of great value to WWE to be featured on all of their properties, whether it be linear or streaming.
Right. The funny thing now is that, like, that's a great question to ask. I don't know how we ever get an answer. I mean, we'll see what promotions and what commercials and what tie-ins they have across the NBC Universal ecosystem. But how are we going to know now what the performance of WrestleMania was in terms of publicly? I'm sure they'll have some internal data. Whether or not they're going to share anything with the investors or with the public is another story. In previous years, previous to this one, there would be a post-WrestleMania number. At first, they were, in the earlier days of the network, they were coming out the next day and doing a conference call and saying, this is our WrestleMania number in terms of subscribers. In the last few years, they haven't done that, but they still have published it in the following earnings report. And of course, before the network, we would get reports, maybe through the Observer, but through WWE at least, about how many pay-per-view buys WrestleMania sold. So
those days are gone, I think, Brandon. Like, unless it's NBC, I think it's even more baked in than what we have with the UFC pay-per-views, because when there is a big event, Disney will sometimes release a figure on their earnings call of what a pay-per-view did. We're not even going to have buys. Like, it's going to be so worked into that overall Peacock number that I think it's going to be very difficult to ascertain the performance, especially to try and compare to past WrestleManias of like what your signups are. I think a lot of that is going to be, and how you can break that down, like what they add in a quarter to Peacock, you can't necessarily directly attach to a WWE boost versus a new series that's on Peacock. So I think it's going to be very hard to look at the impact of WrestleMania on that service unless you're getting that internal data that they're probably not going to be too transparent about.
Right. In the case of UFC, there's certainly a transaction happening from the consumer. And Dana White, at least I understand, is still bragging about how many buys Conor McGregor drew and things like that. But
the smaller shows, though, are the ones that are left to.
Are those not getting reported?
Those are. I know that the Observer at the end of the year did have like the estimates of what the shows did, but it's nothing like the regularity that we had in the traditional pay-per-view era, where each show we had like those reports of pretty much the neighborhood of what a show performed in.
Yeah. So like NBC Universal will know, and they'll probably be sharing that information with WWE as far as how many viewers, sort of like a TV rating, how many viewers on average throughout the program were watching it. And that'll be interesting. Another thing that will be a real incentive is how well can we sell advertising against this program. Again, I don't see how investors or wrestling fans who want to have conversations like this, though, are going to be able to learn about any of that. And maybe they will introduce some sort of metric going forward that they will put in that key performance indicator document that you can find at corporate.wwe.com. So maybe that will change and there'll be some sort of reporting there. But I just don't know how anybody's going to be able to find out about the success. I guess what I'm going to do is go to the Google Trends, go to Google Web Search, and try to compare the web search of this year's WrestleMania to prior years to get some sort of idea of interest. But over the years, that's been on an annual decline for a number of years. The web search has.
What kind of lead up are you anticipating for that Fastlane pay-per-view? This will be 3 weeks out from WrestleMania. It seems like this, as we had talked about last week, like it's probably a smart play to try this on a somewhat smaller scale event before you can work out any kinks for WrestleMania, so you don't have any over demand issues for Mania. But in that week leading up, like, are you expecting like an enormous promotional push from more so from the NBC side than just internally with WWE?
I don't know, probably. I mean, they see, WWE as a chance to get a lot of consumers over to their service. So probably something leading up to Fastlane and then something else, especially leading up to WrestleMania. I think it's clear that they want to do one before WrestleMania, a pay-per-view before WrestleMania to make sure that everything's right. And they're doing it 2 days before Fastlane. So they're doing it on March 18th, where I imagine on March 18th, on or around that day, if you are a US W Network subscriber, you will suddenly be a Peacock Premium subscriber. It's interesting. So I'm a $9.99 W Network subscriber. Am I going to be an automatic $4.99 subscriber or an automatic $9.99 subscriber? I imagine there'll be a lot of communication around that, hopefully.
I'm just hoping that the algorithm somehow works out that you finish an episode of The Office and they send you over to an episode of Smoky Mountain Wrestling.
That would be fantastic. Yeah.
We also had the statistic here that, the cost of the ThunderDome, this is not cheap. They cited a figure that it is 25% more per episode that they're running the ThunderDome at, and that certainly played a factor in this past quarter. When it comes to the expenses of the ThunderDome, where did you kind of ballpark this that this would be as significant as that figure above a traditional episode?
Not quite that high. So, and this is a lot of what I think is driving the stock price to go down today, is that there's a lot of caution from Christina Salen, who's the WWE chief financial officer, about how much WWE is going to incur in expenses in 2021. I was kind of surprised last week, Monday, when they put out this guidance, basically saying that 2021, despite there being guaranteed escalating core content rights fees for Raw and SmackDown, despite there being contracts that guarantee they're going to take in more revenue for TV, despite that, they're going to still be only about as profitable. No more, no less. They're guiding a range of $270 million to $203 million compared to this year, where I think they did $286 million, or I should say 2020. So the 2020 number is right in the middle of their projection for 2021. So it's not as if this company is going to be more profitable despite guaranteed revenues that should be increasing, probably breaking $1 billion. I've been waiting a few years for them to break $1 billion, and maybe it'll finally be 2021. But the ThunderDome turns out to be quite expensive. So there's a lot of confusion in Q3. That was the first quarter where there was some ThunderDome time in there. The ThunderDome was introduced at the end of August, so there's about half of a quarter there, I think, with the ThunderDome. There's no Capitol Wrestling Center yet until early October. That is in Q4. So originally I thought, well, how much could they be spending on the ThunderDome? I could see them, we had just been coming off of the last conference call where Vince really got grilled on ratings, and he had to bring up, yet another excuse after like a year of excuses from on these responses to analysts. And so it was clear that they really needed to do something for Raw and SmackDown to help it out. And they did the ThunderDome, and I thought, well, how much would they be willing to invest in trying to repair ratings? And maybe they would be willing to invest as much as they were spending previously on production expenses when they were going from arena to arena. So that's kind of what I modeled in when I did an estimate at the time. And I didn't realize, if I had been studying, though, my Q3 reports over prior years, I would have known that in every Q3 for a number of years in a row, WWE gets a production incentive of several $1 million. I don't totally understand why, but it's something from the government that basically gives them a discount or a rebate against some of their expenses, I guess in exchange for, doing entertainment production in a certain region. So they got about, I think it's $18.5 million of production incentives that basically offset a lot of their production incentives in Q3. So I think a lot of people came away from Q3 saying, oh, the ThunderDome must not have been that expensive. But here we are in Q4, and now they're not in the Amway Center doing the ThunderDome. They're in Tropicana Field. I've heard some people say, and then maybe you would know, John, it does the production at Tropicana Field look even more elaborate than it did at the Amway Center. There's that, maybe. They're at a stadium rather than the Amway Center. I don't see that being a huge difference in expense relative to the production expenses in terms of the video screens and the lights and all the other stuff there. And then in addition to that, now we've got a full quarter where they're not just doing the ThunderDome, but they're doing the Capitol Wrestling Center at the PC as well. So it looks like, according to some things that Christina Salen said, it looks like this is even more expensive than they anticipate production being when they do, in a post-COVID world, get to return to full-scale events. I think she said production costs in 2022 may decline somewhat related to 2021. So that makes me think in 2022 you expect hopefully the world to be more normal again, doing regular ticketed TV tapings. But production costs will be on the decline relative to this year. So that I'm trying to read the tea leaves here, and I think what she's saying is the ThunderDome, or at least the combination of the ThunderDome and the Capitol Wrestling Center, is more expensive than it would be if we were in a non-COVID world.
It was also brought up that they are not looking at fans beyond the 2 nights of WrestleMania until the second half of the year. I would say like they're being pretty conservative in that sense. You've also invested a lot in this ThunderDome and I'm sure that they're looking at, yes, could we open up our doors and fans would come? Yes, but week after week, 3 shows a week, really, when you're including NXT, that if you can't tour, is that the most prudent choice to be having at the moment? And they've obviously felt like the expenses for the ThunderDome offset any of the, added revenue of just selling tickets just because we can in Florida.
Right. And clearly AEW has decided differently. Mm-hmm. Granted, AEW is, I think they're doing 2 weeks of taping at in back-to-back days or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So it's not as if they're doing 3 tapings every week, which is basically what WWE is doing. So maybe there's just a resistance to not wanting to do what these small-time startups are doing over here. But yeah, I mean, and maybe there's a perception of, we don't know what it's going to look like, and maybe it looks small time and you've got few people and there's empty seats. So maybe it looks better to have the big production, big Thunderdome production set out there instead.
This was our second call where Nick Khan and Christina Salen were front and center. Any just overall opinions? Like certainly it was the two of them were leading this call throughout, and I think notable the fact that Vince McMahon was very much in a background role outside of an introductory message at the beginning of this call. Like this was Nick Khan.
Were you listening to this live?
Yes,
I was listening to it live and listening to the jazz music, enjoying the jazz music, but it ended up being 10, 12 minutes past 5 o'clock, and I heard nothing. And then all of a sudden, I heard Nick Khan start to talk. Did you experience the same thing? Like we missed out on the Vince comments. I have since listened back, and they're there. But
yeah,
did that happen for you?
I had called in, and I got right at the beginning where it was Michael White's, and then Vince did a really short message before it went over to Nick Khan. So they must have just had a different cut in. But yeah, but that was the only comments from Vince, right, even midway during the call when the big return of Laura Martin occurred. And
Laura Martin from Needham tried to ask Vince a question, and there was a pause of a few seconds, and then you heard, "This is Nick. I can take that." But I think so. This is, as you're saying, this is Nick Khan and Christina Salen's second conference call here, and I think last time my feeling was Nick Khan was very impressive, and it looked like he was the right kind of executive that WWE needed for its time where, man, what's going to be more important to this company than media rights? Nothing, financially. So that was something that made me feel pretty optimistic, and clearly Vince he has never felt more optimistic than he did at that point, he said. But I think I was thinking about it the other night that when I was writing a preview that, you think about Barrios and Wilson left this company about a year ago. And I think what they've done is, that you can kind of look at it as they haven't replaced 2 people in Barrios and Wilson with 2 people. I think they've replaced those 2 people with essentially 3 people, where you have Nick Khan has a similar title to Michelle Wilson and the chief revenue officer, but he's also the president, has the president title as well, because he's leading all these media rights negotiations. And in the CFO role, which was formerly held by George Barrios, we got Christina Salen in there. And then there's Stephanie McMahon, who I think is taking over a lot of the position that Michelle Wilson used to inhabit in terms of branding and marketing. So I think that's what's happening there. And people will notice that Stephanie McMahon is now advertised for these things as well. So I think this is as much about the elevation of Stephanie in addition to these 2 new executives here who have come in after the co-presidents exited.
And it also seems like, not that this is a new thing, but even more so that, a lot of those chats that they would send Barrios out to do, like that seems to be Stephanie's territory now. She has got, it seems a lot of those commitments are hers to go out and really speak to those. A lot of stuff that I see Stephanie doing, I see on LinkedIn where she's doing a lot of these women of sports type talks. Mm-hmm. That you pointed out to me that Christina Salen talk that she did that was a part of some kind of conference that I've heard of before, where she's blared out by the window from the light from the window, and technology was not on her side. Which, I mean, Stephanie did outline in this that the technology, it was time for us to pivot away from technology. And that call certainly, I think, gave you a snapshot of that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. Maybe when there's no more COVID or people are traveling around and attending events in person again. I could see Nick Khan being somebody who goes to these conferences and talks about the future of media. He has a lot of opinions. At certain points in this Q&A, he kind of jumps into like explaining the wider media ecosystem, in response to some of the questions rather than, directly answering the questions. But yeah, as far as how do I feel about them, I think they're an improvement in terms of being, I think Nick Khan is an improvement for one thing in terms of having more confidence that WWE is going to continue to maximize its media rights value. That hasn't changed. I mean, just rhetorically, to hear him have the, try to explain away ratings as, everything is fine is interesting. But then again, I wonder, well, what else can you say? It is interesting to think about, to what degree do these people in the room understand the state of the product that they're dealing with? Do they understand that the quality of the product is not good? And do they understand that WWE is missing out on a lot of its potential if the product were better? For example, I think maybe these massive production expenses that they're incurring with the ThunderDome that they had to incur to repair the ratings, which it did, but maybe if the product was better, that wouldn't be as urgent of a need, and those expenses wouldn't need to be as high to get ratings to where they are. Maybe if the product was better and created stars more and told compelling stories better, W Network subscribers would be higher, and maybe the W Network would be a better deal on its own, or maybe they could have driven a better deal from Peacock relative to the number of paid subscribers they had. So I don't know. I mean, I guess what else are you going to say? Even if you do understand that, what else are you going to say if you are in this field where live sports content is multiplying in value? So that's a good place to be. The particular product that you have isn't very good. Nonetheless, it's the leader in its industry by far. And there's no end in sight in terms of WWE continuing to grow its media rights value. That's more assured now with the Peacock deal. But maybe there's something to be said about, hey, look, the ratings are, whatever you want to say about the ratings, we still got a pretty strong young audience. Now, granted, AEW's got a larger portion of its viewing audience in the younger demographics. But, it is true that WWE does better with certain demographics like African Americans and Hispanic Americans than AEW. And you can make the argument that you have a younger audience relative to general viewership, and you have a more diverse audience relative to other wrestling programs. So,
Nick Khan also brought up seemed very bullish on, creating content and developing stars for specific regions of the world, isolating India and Latin America. And that seems to be a prime focus of his, is whether it's, as we talked about last week, taking other international versions of the WWE network and setting up other international licensing deals, but also just creating talent, creating content for outside areas. And this kind of differs from past international expansion plans that nowhere in there was, touring front of mind. It was more so content creation and selling that content to different areas of the world. And that seems to be, maybe Nick Khan's his smaller projects over the next year or so is, selling international licensing.
And we learned his sister is Manachka Khan.
I did not know that until he mentioned that. I had no idea.
Yes. And did you catch this stat that the Superstar Spectacle, which was broadcast on all of these Sony platforms, a story broken by John Pollock and Brandon Thurston, by the way, that show would be happening, did a viewership that was 5 times higher than the average weekly ratings for Raw and SmackDown in India. I don't know what kind of context to put that in, whether it was broadcast in the same manner at the same time, but,
I took it as across Sony's platforms. That's what it sounded like. They didn't exactly spell it out. I'm always kind of skeptical of numbers like that are just thrown out, but I mean, regardless, I think that it was viewed as a success on Sony. And you have to look at that being like, that was the first international market mentioned by Nick Khan. I would say that when you look at the list of priorities of areas of the world, India seems to be number one.
Yeah. And Bad Bunny was also brought up as, a way that they're targeting the Latin American, region. I did not know that Bad Bunny was such a big deal. According to Nick Khan, he was the most streamed artist of 2020 on Spotify. And the co-branded Bad Bunny WWE merch, which I have since looked up, there's some T-shirts, and it's all the same image, but it's on T-shirts and hoodies and posters.
The Bad Bunny replica belt cannot be too far away.
That is the way to go. That's right, because they mentioned that they had a 100% increase in the sales of replica belts, and that they have a deal with an unnamed major sports league to do replica belts that have the team logo on them. So look for that. But yeah, according to Nick Khan, the Bad Bunny WWE merch was the hottest selling item on record for WWE's e-commerce.
I mean, that's very impressive. I mean, if they've just put that merchandise on sale already, like it seems to be like this is, we see so many attempts at celebrity crossovers that seem to just be one and done appearances. Like it seems like they do have a bit of a strategy here of using Bad Bunny beyond just this appearance at the Royal Rumble.
Yeah, maybe Bad Bunny and Booker T teaming up at WrestleMania against is it the Miz that he's been Miz and Morrison?
Yeah, we could say Damian Priest was, I mean, really of all the talent on the roster, Damian Priest was the only one really mentioned it was like Damian Priest and Bad Bunny you would take away as like the focal points here that Nick Khan specifically cited here, aiming at a Puerto Rican fan base.
Yeah, Damian Priest got a name drop. Sasha Banks got a name drop for being on The Mandalorian. There's going to be some sort of, not all of this stuff was clearly spelled out. But there's going to be some sort of film or TV series that's going to come out through WWE Studios that will be voiced over by they didn't put it this way, but retired wrestler and now voiceover actor John Cena. I'm surprised at how many commercials I catch where I'm like, that's John Cena trying to sell me a truck. As far as it is interesting what names, wrestler names get dropped. And I have only started to go through the 10K, which is the 104-page annual report. But they'll put somebody on the cover. Like in some years, it's been Asuka or Charlotte or Roman Reigns. But we do have a count of almost 300 superstars are under contract. Of course, 85% of them have been developed in the Performance Center. But they do mention, I guess this is like 5 or so, Roman Reigns, Sasha Banks, the Street Profits, Otis, and Bianca Belair. Those are the wrestlers that they chose to name as the examples of wrestlers who are active on their main roster. So that's interesting. It's just interesting, who they pick and to try to think about why they pick. But these are clearly, those are people who they see as big stars for them. Roman Reigns, Sasha Banks, Street Profits, Otis, and Bianca Belair.
Yeah, I don't know quite where Otis fits into that other category, but the others, I think you can certainly check off that box.
Vince loves him, I'm sure.
Look at him. Also, this was, I guess, more reassurance than I was necessarily expecting in the call, but when the topic of NBC Sports Network shutting down was addressed and what potential impact that could have on Raw or NXT, Nick Khan sounded pretty confident it's going to have no impact. Not so much surprising with Raw, but for NXT, given how big of a night that is for the NHL on the NBC Sports Network, their deal is up with NBC this year. He sounded pretty confident it's not going to affect NXT on Wednesday nights.
Yeah, I think that's the probably the biggest news story for general wrestling consumption is that he seemed quite adamant that that's not going to affect NXT. And he said, NBC Sports Network folding will have no effect on Raw or NXT. So he must have been reassured by someone at NBC Universal that Wednesday nights are yours. Maybe where else is NHL on Wednesday night going to go? Because I can't think that they're going to not continue to do NHL on Wednesday night. And the things that I've heard from, I think, people like John O'Rand, who, know the sports media business better than I do, they think that NHL is going to stay with NBC Universal because that's been a good relationship there. So maybe that goes to Peacock, or maybe it goes to what other network could it go to? I don't know. But it sounds like it's staying on Wednesday night. So no rest for the Wednesday Night Wars.
I thought that, sometimes I always try to pick out like the one line that I'm going to regurgitate back to you, Brandon. And I thought I had it all sealed when Stephanie McMahon gave her very prepared statement and inserted the joke about Bad Bunny showing up on Raw in a Bugatti. I never thought I'd see a Bugatti on Raw. But then later, deep in the call, building upon the 3 I's, we got Nick Khan's 3 R's for partner satisfaction. Ratings, relevancy, and revenue.
Relevancy. That's a good one. That's sort of like adjusted OIBDA and relevancy. If everything else isn't going well, at least you've got adjusted OIBDA and relevancy. But I don't know what that means. And it sort of just points to like, I don't know how we're going to know. That was brought up in relation to how do we measure success for content on Peacock. Revenue that they sell for advertisers, the ratings, which I guess would be the viewership that they drive on Peacock, which again, I don't know if we're going to know, and the relevancy, which I don't know how one would measure relevancy, but yeah,
I guess there's at least linear relevancy or digital relevancy.
Yeah, we'll see.
What's your forecast? Like just totally spitballing here. Do you expect them to get to Saudi Arabia in 2021? Do you think that is a reasonable expectation or is too high an expectation level given the uncertainty?
I think it's reasonable to think that they'll get there once in the second half of the year. Hopefully everyone will get vaccinated, or enough people will get vaccinated and we'll be able to have some normal live events. That second Saudi event was usually positioned in October or November anyway, so that's pretty late in the year. But I think it's quite possible that there'll be one. And Vince has said in the past that, don't worry, all these Saudi events that we're missing out on are just going to be tacked on to the end of the 10-year contract. So don't worry, you're not missing out on any Saudi events. They're just being deferred. I think it's possible. I think this is going to be a similarly profitable year, 2021 to 2020. But I think, we'll see what happens and it'll be probably a higher revenue year, but a higher year in terms of expenses.
What are the big questions coming out of this call going into the new year that you have that weren't answered in this call?
I guess what's going to happen with NXT was not really addressed other than it sounds like they're staying on Wednesday night. So I would guess that we're going to see NXT renew on Wednesday night with NBC Universal to stay on USA. Really, in terms of revenue for this company, if NXT is worth, let's just give it a really generous range of 20 million to 60 million, somewhere in that range. Then we're talking about something that's in the ballpark of their biggest international deals. Because I think India is worth about 50 million average annual value. UK is worth maybe something less than that, but not by too much less. So this NXT deal, if it is worth somewhere in the range of 20 to 60 million, which I think is a pretty good range, it's probably falling somewhere in there. That's going to be as big as any international deal. And I would see, if this was an India deal, you would see the analysts, talking about it in every one of their reports that they put out. But nobody really knows how to deal with it, I guess, because it is a new property and the viewership is much lower. But and we have no history of what this has been worth in the past.
Well, Brandon, I always want to thank you for dropping by and chatting about the earnings calls that the WWE puts out. These are always of great value and entertainment, as are everyone's should be going towards the Wrestlenomics Pro Wrestling Industry Report that you dropped earlier this week. And I just want to give you the floor is yours. What people can expect and where they can go check out this industry report that highest of recommendations from myself. This thing, not only is it packed with information, but it just looks, it looks stunning. It's a beautiful layout. Like it's just appealing to the eye, Brandon.
Yeah, well, I've been in Microsoft Word every day in the month of January, laboring away at the 2020 report, which I did one last year, which got a lot of people to read it. That was happening just after the Barrios and Molson story. So everybody was, I think a lot of people in the investment community were trying to understand W business at that time. And that was something that was helpful for them. So I figured I'd do it again. And it's even longer this year 48 pages last year, 63 this year. Who knows what will happen in 2021. But the first 2/3 or so of it is just a lot of facts, a lot of key metrics, including there's company profiles in there. There's all sorts of views about viewership throughout the year of 2020, including total audience, key demo 18 to 49, 18 to 34, trying to look at as well how these wrestling programs, in terms of viewership, are performing relative to TV overall, because you always hear people talk about, the latest TV rating and apologizing for it by saying that all television is down. Well, we're trying to unpack that to some degree there. Taking a look at just the annual trends in live events, and to whatever extent there were live events in 2020, looking at consumer products as well, just sort of looking at the licensing deals that WWE, AEW, and New Japan have, looking at W Network subscribers, New Japan World subscribers, and then there's a lot of Google web search stuff in there, looking at not just the major companies, including WWE, AEW, New Japan, Impact, Ring of Honor, but looking at a lot of the next tier of companies as well, and just looking at how their Google web search queries are trending. Because I think Google web search, while it can be misleading at times, especially when there's a big news event or like a scandal, negative story, I wrote a piece in there too about how you can look at the differences in year-over-year change in the Google web search results for various companies. And what you find is that you can tie a lot of those trends to trends in consumer metrics that are actually related to revenues. So that's in there. And again, the last third or so is sort of some analysis, some written analysis about the business, including my annual barrel of Vince's creative in the most technical terms, and some talk about WWE talent, or not just WWE talent, but really the development of the talent overall in the industry, and what COVID is doing to the independents, and how the various companies have actually quite different developmental strategies in place. And there's probably a lot of other stuff too that I'm just not thinking of off the top of my head. And you can get it either one of two ways: by either being a patron at patreon.com/WrestleNomics. If you're a $5 a month supporter, you get that. It's in a post. You just download it right out of the post as a PDF, or you can download the PDF for $6 on PayHip. And,
have you noticed over the past year, do you find like there is a larger audience now for this work that you're putting out? Is it similar to a year ago? Because I just think, like, I haven't looked into it deeply, but it just seems like there is a growing appetite for this aspect of the wrestling industry that a lot of fans are drawn to.
I think there's a growing appetite for it. What helps last year is selling way better than this year, though, because I don't know what happened at first, or if there was something I don't think there was something else, because I released it on January 27th, 2019, and there was a nice spike in sales then, and then 3 days later, the Barrios and Wilson story happened, and then there was an even bigger spike. So I think it's just about the frenzy of what by luck happened when I released that report last year. But there's quite a bit of interest. And the other thing, I think maybe that's, I'm analyzing my own business now. The other thing that's, masking or changing the effect is that I cannibalized pay-per-view, and I'm selling the W Network. So now, last year, the only way to buy it was through PayHip for an individual purchase. And now, the most avid Wrestlenomics, economists are at Patreon. So all the people who probably would have been the most interested in buying it are already supporting Wrestlenomics. So there's that as well. But I haven't done a full revenue breakdown just yet.
Well, it's top level work. I highly encourage everyone to go check out the report, as well as all of the work that Brandon puts out at WrestleNomics.com. I'm sure he will have a big breakdown this weekend. Vince McMahon did not give you a whole lot of material to work with, quote wise, but I'm sure you will make it work. And I hope that sometime during 2021, can we dream, Brandon? Maybe we will get at least one public call from George Barrios and Michelle Wilson for ISO's capital management.
I'm sure they'll do conferences or something. They'll do some sort of virtual public appearance, I bet.
goatee George Barrios. That's what his post WWE look is reflecting. And I think we all would love some George Barrios in our life to talk about moats and ecosystems and all his. I guess he'll retire all his wrestlers that he grew up loving, such as what was the one he really butchered? Was it Ricky Steamboat?
Ricky the Steamboat Dragon.
That was the best one. That was his. A big fan of Ricky the Steamboat Dragon.
His favorite current wrestler is Shawn Rollins.
My favorite too. He's been watching him right from the get-go. So George Barrios, we can never have enough of him. And we can't have enough of Brandon Thurston. Give him a follow on Twitter at Brandon Thurston. And we always appreciate the time, and we'll speak after Q2.
Absolutely. Anytime. Thanks for having me.